I want you to picture this. 60 feet above a sawdust ring, in front of 900 people who paid good money to watch me do the one thing I was never supposed to fail at, my body betrayed me. Mid-swing, mid-breath. A wave of heat rolled up through my spine so fast I nearly lost my grip on the bar, and for one terrifying second, hanging in the air with my whole life depending on my hands, I thought, this isn't possible. My suppressants don't run out for another 4 months. Someone had made sure they did. I didn't know that yet, hanging up there with my palms sweating through the chalk, the crowd gasping at what they thought was just an especially daring routine. I didn't know that the woman who ran the entire show, the coldest, most controlled alpha most of us had ever worked for, was about to walk into that ring, stop a performance mid-show for the first time in the circus's 40-year history, and change absolutely everything about how the rest of my life was going to go. But to understand how I ended up there, shaking on a platform while an entire big top held its breath, you need to know who I was before any of it happened. Let's back up. My name is Ren. I was raised in this circus, more or less, dropped off as a kid with a mother who couldn't keep me and a father nobody ever named, taken in by a troop of strangers who became, over 17 years, the only family I ever really had. I learned to walk a wire before I learned long division. I learned that an Omega who wants respect in a world built for alphas doesn't ask for it. She earns it, twice as hard, and then makes it look effortless so nobody can say it cost her anything. I was good at my job. I want to say that clearly, because so much of what happened afterward tried to make it about what I was instead of what I could do. I was the best aerialist this circus had produced in a decade, and everyone from the ticket takers to the old lion tamer who'd been there since before I was born knew it. I ran my body like a business. Suppressants on schedule, no exceptions, no excuses, because one bad heat at the wrong moment doesn't just cost you a show. It costs you the only home you've ever had. The circus had new ownership that season, a fact that had every performer on edge for weeks before I ever laid eyes on her. The old owner, a soft, distracted man named Callahan who'd run the show into quiet decline for a decade, had retired, abruptly at the end of the previous season. No announcement, no goodbye tour, just a terse letter and a new name on the paperwork by the time we regrouped in spring. Nobody could tell me exactly why he left so fast, and every time I asked, people found somewhere else to be. That should have been my first clue. I didn't know it yet. The new owner arrived on our first rehearsal day in a black coat that looked wrong against the dust and rope of a circus tent, like she'd been poured into the wrong movie. She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't have to. The entire company went quiet the second she stepped into the ring, the particular, instinctive quiet that alphas of a certain caliber produce just by existing in a room. Her name was Roan Ashworth, and within an hour I understood exactly why Callahan had run. If a story like this pulls you in from the first minute, the kind where you can already feel the danger circling before the characters can go ahead and subscribe now, because what happens inside that tent over the following weeks is only the beginning, and I promise you the ending is not what you think it's going to be. Roan Ashworth ran the circus the way I ran my own body, with total, unforgiving discipline. She walked the grounds every morning before anyone else was awake, inspecting rigging with her own hands instead of trusting a report. She fixed rehearsal schedules that had been broken for years. She fired a rigger within her first week for cutting corners on a safety check, and did it so calmly, so completely without cruelty, that the rest of us understood immediately she wasn't interested in fear. She was interested in competence, and she recognized it instantly wherever she found it. She recognized it in me on day 3. I was running my routine alone, an hour before the rest of the company arrived, because that's what I always did, earn the difficulty before anyone else got to watch me make it look easy. I didn't know she was there until I dropped out of a full twist and heard, from the shadows near the entrance, a single word. Good. I nearly fell out of my landing. You're not supposed to be here yet. Neither are you. She stepped into the light, arms crossed, studying me with an expression I couldn't read yet. Not admiration exactly, not yet, but close attention, the kind of look that made you feel like you were being cataloged. Do you always train before call time? Every day. Why? Because the version of me that only practices when someone's watching isn't good enough to keep this job. I said it flatter than I meant to, more challenge than I usually allowed myself with new management, but something about her made bravado feel like the only safe register to speak in. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Keep doing that," she said, and walked out before I could figure out what to say back. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't the last surprise she had for me that week. 2 days later, I found a new set of grip tape in my trunk, the exact brand I'd been quietly rationing because the circus's usual supplier had switched to something cheaper that tore my calluses raw. No note. No explanation. When I asked the equipment manager about it, he just shrugged and said the order had come directly from Roan's office. No discussion required. I didn't say anything to her about it. I wasn't sure yet what saying something would even sound like. Thank you felt too small, and anything bigger felt like admitting I'd noticed a kindness I wasn't supposed to read into. So I said nothing, and used the new tape, and told myself it was simply good management, an owner who understood that a well-equipped performer was a safer investment. I almost believed it. Here's the thing nobody tells you about working for someone who terrifies an entire company. It's addictive to be the one person she doesn't terrify. I started noticing the way her attention would land on me and stay a half second longer than it landed on anyone else. I started noticing that she watched my rehearsals from the same spot near the entrance more mornings than not, silent, arms crossed, never commenting unless something was actually wrong with my form. I started, against every instinct I had, looking forward to those mornings more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was professional respect. I was good at my job. She valued competence. That was all it was. I had spent my whole life keeping my Omega status a quiet, managed fact, rather than an identity anyone got to have opinions about. And the last thing I wanted, the last thing I could afford, was for a new Alpha owner to start looking at me like something instead of someone. But there were small things I couldn't quite explain away. The morning she noticed my hands shaking slightly from a bad night's sleep, and without a word, had a mug of tea waiting on the equipment trunk before I even asked. The afternoon, she shut down a visiting sponsor who'd made a comment about the pretty little Omega who does the flying. With 4 words, so cold the man apologized twice and left early. The way once, reaching past me for a clipboard, her hand had grazed my shoulder and she'd actually stopped completely, pulled back and said, quiet and deliberate, "Sorry, I should have asked." Nobody asks. That's the part that got under my skin. In 17 years around alphas who ran everything from the ticket booth to the animal cages, I had never once had one stop mid-motion to check whether contact was welcome. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. It meant everything. There was a woman in the company, an older wire walker named Delphine, who caught me staring after her one afternoon and laughed under her breath. "You've got that look," she said, not unkindly. "Every performer who's ever worked under a decent owner gets that look eventually. Enjoy it while it lasts. Good ones don't come around often, and when they do, half of us fall a little in love with just being treated like we matter." She said it like a joke, but there was something knowing in her eyes that made me wonder how many people in that company had already noticed what I was still trying to talk myself out of. If you're the kind of person who already knows exactly what it means when someone with all the power in the room decides to ask permission anyway, you already know this story is only getting started. Stay with me, because the next part is where the danger starts, and it does not come from where either of us expected it. The first strange incident happened 10 days after Roan arrived, and I almost didn't think anything of it. A rigging bolt on the west platform, worn but not broken, replaced early during a routine safety check she'd instituted her first week. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Except that same bolt had passed inspection just 4 days earlier, signed off by a rigger who'd worked the circuit for 15 years and never made a mistake like that in his life. The second incident was harder to explain away. My chalk bag, always kept in the same trunk, in the same corner, turned up half empty one morning with a residue on the inside that wasn't chalk at all, something slicker. Something that would have made my grip fail at exactly the wrong moment if I hadn't noticed the texture wrong under my fingers before I climbed. I almost didn't catch it. That's the part that still unsettles me most, looking back. How close it came to being nothing more than a bad grip and a worse fall, chalked up afterward, if I'd survived it at all, to an experienced performer having an inexplicable off night. I'd run my hand into that bag 1,000 times without thinking, and the only reason I noticed anything wrong that particular morning was a half-second habit of rubbing the chalk between my palms before a climb, a tic so old I couldn't tell you when I'd picked it up. The residue felt wrong against my skin, faintly slick where chalk should have been dry and rough, and something old and careful in me, the same instinct that had kept me alive on a wire since I was a child, told me to stop before I trusted that bag with my life. I brought it to Roan myself, more out of instinct than any real theory. She turned the bag over in her hands for a long moment, expression unreadable, then looked up at me with something sharper than I'd seen from her yet. Has anything else felt wrong lately, even something small? I hesitated, because the honest answer involved a fact I didn't share with anyone, let alone a new alpha boss I'd known for 2 weeks. But something about the seriousness in her face made me tell her anyway. My cycle's been off, I admitted. Not by much, a few days here and there. I thought it was stress, the new season, new management. I've adjusted my suppressant dose to compensate. Something tightened at the corner of her jaw. How long have you been compensating? Since before you got here. She was quiet for a long moment, turning that over, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something low and careful. I need you to bring me your suppressant bottle. Today, if you can. Why? Because someone tampered with your chalk, she said. And I don't believe in coincidences involving the same person twice in the same 2 weeks. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because it wasn't purely fear, though there was plenty of that too. There was also something like anger, old, familiar anger, the kind I'd spent years learning to swallow because a furious Omega gets dismissed twice as fast as a calm one. Someone in my own company, someone who ate meals alongside me, who applauded the same routines I'd bled and broken bones learning, had decided my body was an acceptable thing to tamper with in service of some plan I didn't yet understand. I remember standing in that tent, holding a chalk bag that had nearly got me killed, and feeling, for the first time in a long while, like the careful, managed calm I'd built my whole identity around wasn't going to be enough to keep me safe this time. I brought her the bottle that afternoon, feeling half ridiculous and half genuinely afraid for the first time since the season started. She didn't open it in front of me. She sent it, quietly, to a chemist she trusted in the city, and told me, in that same low, careful voice, to keep taking my normal dose until she heard back, and to tell absolutely no one what we suspected. Why no one? Because if someone in this company is doing this to you, the safest thing you can do right now is let them believe it's still working. I want to pause here for a second, because this is the part where the story stopped being about a new boss I found unexpectedly compelling, and started being about a threat neither of us fully understood yet. If you've ever had the ground shift under you slowly enough that you almost didn't notice until it was too late to pretend otherwise, you know exactly the feeling I'm describing. And if this story already has you hooked, make sure you're subscribed, because what we found out about that bottle 3 days later is the moment everything accelerated. The chemist's report came back on a Thursday. Roan found me before the evening show, pulled me into the empty tent an hour before call time, and didn't soften any of it. Someone diluted your suppressants, not enough to be obvious on a casual check, enough that your body's been running on roughly 60% of the dose you think you've been taking for at least 3 weeks. The floor tilted a little under me. That's not possible. I keep that bottle locked in my trunk. Which means whoever did this either has a key or knows how to get into a locked trunk without leaving a mark. Her voice was even, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something coiled tight. Ren, I need you to think carefully. Who has access to your things? Who would benefit from you being incapacitated, even temporarily? I ran through the list in my head, the rigger who'd been fired, the handful of performers who'd resented my position at the top of the bill for years, a stagehand who'd made a comment once about Omegas taking spots that should go to someone who could actually commit to the schedule year-round. And none of it added up to anything solid enough to say out loud. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know who'd want to do this to me specifically. Maybe it isn't about you specifically, Roan said, and something in the way she said it made me go still. Maybe it's about me, about making this season fall apart in a way that looks like an accident. You're the biggest draw on this bill. If something happened to you publicly, badly, in a way that looked like negligence, it would destroy the circus's reputation in a single night, I finished, understanding landing hard and cold. And whoever bought it out of the wreckage afterward would get it for nothing. She nodded once, grim. That's the shape of it. I don't have proof yet. I have a diluted bottle and a bad feeling. But I intend to get proof, and until I do, I need you closer to me than you're going to be comfortable with. Not because I don't think you can handle yourself. A pause, and something almost gentle came into her voice. Because I don't think either of us can afford to find out the hard way what happens if I'm right. I should have felt afraid in that moment, and some part of me was. But what I mostly felt, standing there in an empty tent with a woman who just laid out a genuine conspiracy against everything I'd built my life around, was something closer to relief. For the first time in 3 weeks of unexplained small wrongnesses, someone else could see it too. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining things. And whatever was coming, I wasn't going to have to face it completely alone. That's exactly the kind of relief that gets people in trouble. And if you're waiting to find out whether it did, stick around. Because 2 nights later, 60 feet in the air, I found out my suppressants weren't the only things someone had been counting on to fail. The heat hit me mid-performance on a Saturday, the biggest house of the month, every seat sold. I'd taken my adjusted dose that morning, the highest amount Roan and I had agreed was safe to compensate for weeks of dilution, and it should have held. It didn't. I felt it first as warmth low in my stomach, easy to mistake for adrenaline, the ordinary electricity of a big crowd on a big night. By the time I was 30 feet up, hooking my knees over the bar for the release into a full twist, the warmth had become something else entirely. A flush climbing my spine, my skin suddenly, unbearably sensitive against the costume fabric, my hands slick with something that wasn't just performance nerves. I made the twist. Some instinct older than fear kept my body running the choreography even as everything underneath it started coming apart. I made the catch. I made the second release. And on the landing platform, 60 feet above 900 people, my knees buckled for exactly 1 second before I forced them straight again, grabbing the rigging with both hands, breathing hard, sweat running down my back that had nothing to do with the routine. The crowd didn't notice. The crowd never notices the difference between a performer pushing through something and a performer in genuine danger, not until it's too late to matter. But the ringside crew noticed. And Roan, standing at the mouth of the tent where she watched every single show from the same fixed position, noticed before anyone. I don't remember the rest of the routine clearly. I remember heat crawling under my skin like something alive, my vision narrowing at the edges, my body screaming 2 contradictory instructions at once. Finish the routine. You cannot fail in front of this many people, and get down now before you fall. I remember making the final release on pure muscle memory, landing the dismount half a second later than usual, and hearing, through a haze that had nothing to do with the applause, Roan's voice cutting across the ring floor with an authority I'd never heard her use in public before. I remember, too, in fragments, the particular terror of the crowd applauding a routine they had no idea was 1 heartbeat away from disaster. 900 people clapping for a performance that had actually been a woman fighting her own body for control 60 feet in the air. I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that sometimes arrives right before you lose your grip on everything, that if I fell tonight, they would still applaud, right up until the moment they didn't, and that thought terrified me more than the fever itself. House lights up, show's over. 900 people, 40 years of tradition. Nobody had stopped a performance mid-show in the history of that circus, and Roan Ashworth did it in 11 words, striding into the ring in front of every camera phone in the audience, and reaching me at the base of the rigging just as my legs finally gave out for real. She caught me before I hit the ground. I remember that clearly, the solid, sudden certainty of her arms, the low, urgent sound of her voice saying my name like it was the only word she had left, and then very little else until I was somewhere dim and quiet, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like her, my whole body running a fever that had nothing to do with illness. That's where I have to leave things for a moment, because what happened in the hours after she carried me out of that ring is the part of this story that changes everything, not just between the two of us, but for the entire circus, and for whoever had been counting on my failure to bring the whole thing down. If this story has you gripped the way it gripped me living through it, subscribe now, because the next part is where the danger stops being quiet. I woke up in her private car, the one she used as an office, and apparently, sometimes as a home, on a bed that was too soft and too large for the cramped, practical space I'd expected from someone as disciplined as Roan Ashworth. The fever hadn't broken. If anything, it had deepened, my whole body aching with a restless, unbearable need for closeness I hadn't experienced since my first heat as a teenager, back before I'd learned to manage my own biology like a schedule instead of a storm. Roan was in the corner of the room, as far from the bed as the small space allowed, sitting perfectly still with her back straight and her hands folded, like she was holding herself in place by sheer will. When she saw my eyes open, she didn't move any closer. "You're safe," she said, low, steady. "You're in my car. Doctor's already been and gone, you're stable. This is just your body running the heat it should have run 3 weeks ago, compressed into one very bad night because of what was done to your suppressants. It'll pass. You need water and rest, and someone should probably stay close in case the fever spikes again." "Are you staying?" My voice came out rougher than I meant it to, half from the fever, half from something underneath it I didn't have the clarity to examine yet. "If you want me to." She still hadn't moved from that chair. "I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now. I am an alpha, and you are in an unmedicated heat, and being in this room with you is testing every piece of discipline I have. I will not touch you unless you ask me to, specifically, clearly, when you are not running a fever that's making every decision for you. I need you to understand that boundary isn't negotiable, even if you ask me to bend it tonight. Not like this." I want you to understand what that meant, hearing it in that state, body aching for exactly the kind of proximity she was refusing to give me, unless it came with real, clear-headed consent. It would have been so easy for her to take advantage of a moment like that. Easier still to convince herself it wasn't taking advantage at all, that heat-driven want was want enough. She didn't. She sat in that chair for 6 hours, bringing me water, checking my temperature, talking me down from the worst of it with a low, steady voice that never once asked for anything back. And somewhere in the middle of that long, feverish night, underneath everything my body wanted, I understood that I trusted her more completely than I had ever trusted anyone in my life. "Why are you doing this?" I asked her, somewhere near dawn, the fever finally starting to loosen its grip. "Sitting there all night, you could have left this to a nurse." She was quiet for a long moment. "Because someone did this to you on purpose, to hurt this circus through you, and I will not let the first thing you remember about the worst night of your career be an alpha who couldn't control herself around you too." A pause, something rawer coming into her voice. "And because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, watching you train before anyone else was awake, I started wanting things I have absolutely no right to want from someone who works for me, in the middle of a situation this dangerous. I'm not going to act on that tonight. I needed you to know it exists, though. I needed you to know the difference between what I'm allowed to want and what I'm going to do about it." I fell asleep before I could find the right answer to that. When I woke again, fever broken, sunlight coming weak through the car's small window, she was still there, asleep upright in that same chair, having never once, in the entire night, crossed the one line she'd promised not to cross. If you've ever had someone prove exactly how much restraint means by choosing it over everything they wanted, you understand exactly why that morning changed something between us for good. And if you're waiting to find out what happened to whoever tampered with those suppressants, that's coming, faster than either of us expected. Make sure you're subscribed, because the investigation is about to get a great deal more dangerous for both of us. The days after the incident were strange in the particular way a crisis makes everything feel both slower and faster at once. The company knew something had happened. You can't stop a show mid-performance in front of 900 people and expect silence. But Roan controlled the story with the same discipline she controlled everything else. framing it publicly as a sudden illness. Nothing more, protecting my privacy and my status in the company in one careful move. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Me, Roan, and the doctor sworn to confidentiality. I went back to my own trailer 3 days later, back to my own bed, my own schedule, my body slowly recovering its equilibrium on a fresh, unadulterated bottle of suppressants Roan had personally driven into the city to replace. But something had changed in the rhythm between us that didn't go back to normal, along with everything else. She checked on me every morning now, not from a distance near the tent entrance, but directly. A knock on my trailer door, 5 minutes of quiet conversation before the rest of the company woke up. I found myself waiting for that knock the way I used to wait for her silent presence at rehearsal, except now the waiting had a name I could no longer pretend not to recognize. The investigation moved slower than either of us wanted. Roan brought in a private security consultant, an old contact from before she'd taken over the circus, who quietly interviewed staff, reviewed old maintenance logs, and turned up nothing conclusive for almost 2 weeks. Whoever was responsible had been careful, patient, willing to play a long game that suggested real planning rather than a single moment of malice. The break came from an unlikely place. I found it myself, actually, which is a detail I'm proud of, because for a while there it would have been easy to let Roan and her consultant handle everything while I sat back and recovered. I didn't. I went through my own trunk one evening, methodically, the way I approached everything, and found a scrap of paper wedged behind the false bottom where I kept my suppressant bottle. A scrap that had clearly fallen out of someone's pocket while they were in there, tampering with things that weren't theirs to touch. It was a receipt, a hardware store, 20 miles from our current lot, for a chemical compound that had no business being anywhere near a circus, except for exactly the purpose it had apparently been used for. And on the back, in handwriting I recognized immediately because I'd seen it on 100 contracts and schedules over the years. A set of initials that didn't belong to any performer, any rigger, any name on the obvious suspect list Roan, and I had spent 2 weeks building. They belonged to Callahan's old business manager, a quiet, unassuming man named Preston who'd stayed on with the circus after the ownership change, who moved through every tent and trailer with the kind of invisible, trusted access that nobody thought twice about. He balanced the books. He signed off on supply orders. He had, I realized with a cold, sick certainty, more unsupervised access to every trunk and locked space in that circus than almost anyone else alive. I brought the receipt to Roan that night and watched her go very, very still. "He worked for Callahan for 11 years, she said slowly. "I kept him on because everyone told me he was the one steady thing holding the books together through the transition. I never once considered." She stopped herself, jaw tight. "He had access to everything. Every trunk, every schedule, every account. If he wanted this circus to fail publicly enough to force a sale." "Who would benefit from that sale?" I asked. That's the question that cracked the whole thing open, and I promise you, the answer is not who either of us expected. If this story has kept you guessing so far, this is the part where all your guesses are about to be wrong. Stay with me, because the confrontation that follows is the most dangerous either of us came that entire season. It took another week to build a case solid enough to act on. A week where I watched Roan operate with a coldness I hadn't seen from her before, not toward me, never toward me, but toward the situation itself, gathering evidence with the same methodical discipline she brought to everything. Preston had been quietly funneling information to a rival entertainment conglomerate for over a year. We learned, feeding them financial data, scheduling vulnerabilities, anything that would make the circus look unstable enough to buy cheap once it inevitably collapsed under a wave of bad publicity. My heat, my nearly catastrophic fall, had been the final piece of a plan to manufacture exactly the kind of public disaster that tanks a reputation overnight. A disaster that could then be blamed on negligent, incompetent new ownership, forcing a distressed sale at a fraction of the circus's real worth. Roan had been the actual target the entire time. I had simply been the most effective weapon available to use against her. Understanding that didn't make me feel less afraid. If anything, it made the danger feel closer, more personal, because it meant whoever was funding Preston on the other end had been willing to hurt me specifically, use my body and my career as collateral damage in a business dispute that had nothing to do with me at all. That's when things between Roan and I nearly broke for good, not because of the danger itself, but because of what she did in response to it. She pulled me from the bill without discussing it with me first. I found out from the call sheet posted outside the rehearsal tent, my name simply absent from that week's lineup, and when I confronted her about it, storming into her private car without knocking for the first time since the night of my heat, she didn't even try to soften it. It's too dangerous to have you performing while Preston is still out there, and we don't yet know exactly who he's working with, she said, not looking up from the papers on her desk. I've already decided. You're safer staying close to the grounds, out of the public eye, until this is resolved. You decided, I repeated, something cold and furious rising in me that had nothing to do with fever this time. Without asking me about my career, my body, my choice. Ren, you told me, that first night, that you'd never take a choice away from me without asking. That was the whole point. That was why I trusted you enough to let you sit in that chair all night instead of every other alpha I've ever known who would have taken what my body was offering without a second thought. My voice cracked on the last part, more from anger than anything else. And now you're doing exactly what you promised you wouldn't. You're deciding what's safe for me. You're deciding what I'm allowed to risk. That's not protection, Roan. That's the same control every other alpha in my life has tried to put on me, just wearing a gentler face. She went very still, and for a long moment I watched something crack open behind her carefully controlled expression. Not anger, but something closer to fear. The particular fear of someone realizing they'd repeated exactly the mistake they swore they'd never make. I was afraid, she admitted finally, quiet, raw in a way I hadn't heard from her before. I watched you almost fall 60 feet because someone used your own body as a weapon against you, and every instinct I have told me the only way to keep that from happening again was to control every variable I could. I didn't ask you because I was afraid of what happens if I ask, and you say yes to something that gets you hurt worse than last time. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. I just need you to understand it wasn't about doubting your competence. It was about not knowing how to survive watching it happen again. That's not your decision to make for me, I said, softer now, but no less certain. I get to decide what risks I take with my own life, Roan, even the ones that scare you, especially those. If this is going to work, whatever this is, between us, you have to trust me with that every time, not just when it's easy. She nodded slowly, and something in her posture changed, the rigid control loosening just slightly. You're right, I'm sorry, truly. A pause. What do you need from me to fix this? Put me back on the bill, I said, and let me help finish this investigation instead of hiding me from it. I found the receipt that broke this case open, Roan. I'm not a variable you need to control. I'm the person standing next to you fighting the same threat. I need a moment before I tell you what happened next, because if you've ever had to teach someone who loves you that protecting you and controlling you are not the same thing, you know exactly how much courage that conversation takes on both sides. Roan put me back on the bill that same afternoon. And 3 days later, the two of us, together, walked into the final confrontation that ended this entire conspiracy, in front of the whole company, in the one place Preston never expected either of us to corner him. The ring itself, an hour before a sold-out show. We staged it carefully, the two of us working as genuine partners for the first time since the investigation began. Roan called an all-company meeting under the pretense of announcing new safety protocols following my illness, gathering every performer, rigger, and staff member into the big top an hour before doors opened. Preston was there too, unsuspecting, exactly where we needed him. I want to tell you the confrontation was clean and simple, evidence laid out, villain exposed, everyone goes home satisfied. It wasn't. It got ugly fast, in the way these things always do once someone realizes they're cornered. Roan laid out the financial records first. The pattern of information leaked, dates that lined up precisely with visits from a rival conglomerate's representatives, bank transfers routed through accounts that traced, eventually, back to Preston's own name once you knew where to look. He denied it immediately, smooth, practiced, the same steady voice he'd used for 11 years to manage a company's trust. "This is circumstantial," he said. "Anyone could have made those transfers look like they came from me. You're accusing a man who's kept this circus's books balanced for over a decade based on a receipt found in a trunk." That's when I stepped forward with the second piece, a maintenance log, cross-referenced with Preston's own scheduling records, showing he'd been alone in the equipment tent on all 3 dates matching the sabotage incidents. No one else on the grounds able to account for those windows of time. He turned on me instead of the evidence, which is what people do when the facts stop working for them. Of course she'd say that. Look at her, an Omega who nearly cost this whole company its reputation with an unscheduled heat, now standing up here playing detective to protect the Alpha she's clearly sleeping with. You'd believe anything she told you at this point, wouldn't you, Roan? Convenient, how the evidence always seems to point exactly where she wants it to. The tent went dead silent. I felt every eye in the company shift toward me, weighing that accusation, and for one terrible second the old instinct rose up in me, the lifelong habit of shrinking, of proving my competence twice as hard to erase any doubt my biology might have planted in someone's mind. I didn't shrink. I've spent 17 years in this circus, proving what I can do with my own 2 hands. Preston, long before Roan Ashworth ever set foot on these grounds, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I found that receipt myself, in my own trunk, because I refused to let what happened to my body be something that just happened to me instead of something I investigated like everyone else on this ground has a right to. You don't get to use what someone did to me as a weapon to discredit the fact that I caught you. That's not evidence against me. That's exactly why I found you. Roan didn't say a word in my defense. She didn't need to, and more importantly, she understood, watching me, that I hadn't needed her to. She simply let the silence after my answer sit in the tent for a long moment, and then delivered the final piece of proof, a recorded call, obtained legally through her security consultant, of Preston negotiating terms of the coming sale with the rival conglomerate's representative, discussing, explicitly, the timeline for the incident that would tank public confidence enough to force a distressed sale. There was nowhere left for him to go. He was escorted off the grounds that same hour, the authorities notified, the sales scheme collapsing in real time as the conglomerate on the other end scrambled to distance themselves from a conspiracy that had just become criminally exposed in front of an entire company of witnesses. That's the moment the danger finally ended. But it wasn't, I want you to know, the moment this story ended, because what Roan did next, in front of that same crowd, mattered just as much as anything that came before it, and it's the part of this whole thing I think about most, even now. She could have walked away right there, conspiracy resolved, reputation restored, and let whatever was growing between us stay quietly unspoken the way careful people sometimes let good things stay unspoken out of fear. She didn't. She turned to the whole company, still gathered in that tent, and said plainly, in front of every performer and rigger who'd ever whispered about the new Alpha owner and the aerialist she watched too closely, "I want to say something, and I'd rather say it here honestly than let this company keep guessing at it in private." She looked at me, not at anyone else. "Ren solved this before I did. She found the evidence that broke this case open while I was busy trying to protect her by keeping her out of it, which was the wrong instinct, and she was right to tell me so. I'm not going to pretend that isn't the reason I respect her more than almost anyone I've ever worked with, and I'm not going to pretend that respect is the only thing I feel." The tent went very quiet in an entirely different way than it had a few minutes earlier. "I'm not asking anyone's permission for this," she continued, "and I'm not going to make Ren's choices for her the way I already tried to once and got rightfully called out for. But I wanted this company to hear it from me directly, instead of finding out through rumor, because she deserves better than being anyone's secret." She looked back at me. "Whatever happens next is entirely up to you. I just needed it said out loud." I remember every performer in that tent turning to look at me, waiting. The old lion tamer who'd known me since I was 7 years old grinning like he'd been waiting for this exact moment for weeks. I remember the particular, terrifying freedom of getting to choose something in front of everyone, instead of hiding it the way I'd hidden every uncomfortable truth about myself for most of my life. "I get to set the terms," I said, looking directly at her. "Not because I don't trust you, because I need you to prove you meant what you said about respecting my choices every time, not just the easy ones." "Name them," she said without hesitation. "I stay the headline act. My name goes above the tent, same as it always has, and nothing about this changes that." A pause, gathering the rest of my nerve. "And you ask every single time, not because you don't already know the answer, because asking is the whole point." She crossed the ring floor in front of the entire company, stopped close enough that I could see exactly how much restraint it was costing her not to close the last distance immediately, and said, quiet enough that it felt almost private despite the crowd, "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," I said, and she did, gently, in front of an entire circus company that erupted into noise loud enough to rival any show we'd ever put on. If you've ever watched someone learn, in real time, the difference between protecting you and controlling you, and choose the harder, better version of love because of it, you understand exactly why that kiss meant more to me than any round of applause I'd earned in 17 years under that tent. The show went on that night, same as scheduled, my name still above the door exactly where I'd insisted it stay. I ran the same routine I'd run 1,000 times before, except this time, 60 feet up, hanging in the air in front of a sold-out crowd. I found Roan in her usual spot at the mouth of the tent, watching the way she always had, except now there was nothing guarded in the way she watched me at all. 6 months later, the circus was thriving in a way it hadn't since long before Callahan's quiet decline. The scandal, once resolved, had turned into exactly the kind of publicity that fills seats instead of emptying them, and Roan had used the momentum to rebuild the safety protocols and staff trust that Preston's decade of quiet sabotage had worn thin. I helped her do it, not as an aerialist standing outside management decisions the way I once had, but as a genuine partner in how the company ran, my name on schedules and safety reviews alongside my name on the bill. We still do the same thing every morning we ever did. She watches me train an hour before the rest of the company wakes up, standing in that same spot near the entrance, silent until something's worth saying. Except now, some mornings, she climbs the rigging and trains beside me instead of just watching, and every single time, before her hands find mine on the bar to spot a new sequence, she still asks. Every time, exactly like she promised. I think about that first heat sometimes, the worst night of my career, and somehow, the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to me. And I think about how close the whole company came to losing everything, because one careful, patient man decided an Omega's body was the easiest weapon available to use against a woman he wanted to destroy. He was wrong about that, in the end, same as everyone who's ever underestimated exactly how much fight lives inside someone the world keeps trying to call fragile. The big top doesn't shut down for anyone anymore, except once, a long time ago now, for exactly one reason worth stopping the whole show for. And every single night since, when I take that final bow 60 feet above a sold-out crowd, I look for the same face at the mouth of the tent, and I find her there every time, watching the way she always has, except now, when the lights come up and the applause dies down, I get to climb down into arms that asked for the right to hold me, and never once, not since that night, have they stopped. If this story kept you hooked the way it kept me holding on through every twist of it, let me know in the comments what part hit you hardest, and subscribe for the next one, because trust me, this circus isn't the last place two people find exactly what they weren't looking for.